Welcome to a new segment of our program, Coptic Life and Civilization. This is Logos TV, and I'm Michael Saad. Our segment today is in the area of monastic life, and our guest is becoming an expert in the area of influence of Coptic monasticism on Western monasticism. Welcome, Ph.D. candidate, Patricia Eshagh from Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California.
Thank you very much.
This is a fascinating topic, the influence of Coptic monasticism on Western monasticism and Western life and perhaps civilization as well. We can explore this today and some other occasions. It's a broad field. And please tell us about what did you encounter in terms of your research in the subject?
Well, my focus is specifically on looking at ways of transmission, how Western Europe became aware of Coptic monasticism and how they then incorporated those findings into their own monastic development, their own monastic movement, if you will. And so Western Europe in the 4th century was very aware of what was going on in the Egyptian desert, in the monastic movement that was developing there. They became aware of what was going on through textbooks that were being translated into Latin so they could read the stories of the desert fathers and mothers. They could read about the life of Antony. They could read about the life of Pachomius. So there were a lot of materials that they had at their disposal to learn about what was happening and then to use that model to develop their own monastic interests in Western Europe. They also traveled to Egypt. We have a lot of evidence showing that they went to Egypt on pilgrimage as part of their trips to the Holy Land. Many of them stayed in Egypt for short periods. Some stayed for extended periods. So there was physical travel to Egypt to witness what was going on there and to learn the ways and then bring that information back home to incorporate into their own movement of monasticism in Western Europe, but also the texts that were coming out that they could read in Latin. And then we have a situation where people in Egypt had to flee Egypt because of heresies that were going on. People were actually monks were being persecuted for heretical beliefs, and so monks had to flee Egypt. And we have instances such as the case of John Cassian, who initially was a monk living in a monastery in Bethlehem, became aware of what was going on in Egypt because he had a visitor actually living with him who was a leader of an Egyptian monastery. And so he became aware of what was going on in Egypt, decided to leave his monastic home in Bethlehem. He went to Egypt, what was for a planned period of a couple of months, and he ended up staying in Egypt, living amongst the desert fathers and mothers for a period of 15 years. But due to heresies, controversies that were taking place, he had to leave. And he eventually ends up in France, where in the southern area of France, the city of Marseille, where he develops 2 monasteries, one for men, one for women. And he is also asked by the local bishops there to write down what he learned during his experience in the Egyptian desert. And so he writes two books called one is called The Institutes, the other The Conferences. And in these two books, we have documented evidence of Coptic monasticism, something useful for the local bishops. They could read the books, they could incorporate the rules and the lifestyle into their own communities. And so we see a direct connection and a direct influence through the efforts of John Cassian, through his books, and then also through his personal contacts. He develops a friendship with an individual by the name of Honoratus. Honoratus was the leader of a monastic community on an island off the coast of southern France. And so he was a great admirer of John Cassian. And in fact, when he incorporated his own monastery, he used the Pachomian rule, he used the principles of Coptic monasticism when he set up his community there. And this monastery called Léron on this island in the southern tip of France on the coast became a very influential place, a place of learning for many of the bishops of Western Europe. Many of them came through that monastery, so we have that influence. And then we also have Benedict, Saint Benedict, who was another admirer of John Cassian, and he incorporated a lot of the principles that he learned through John Cassian's experience in Egypt into his own monastic rule, the Benedictine rule, which then became popular throughout Western Europe and became the actual rule upon which monasticism took off in Western Europe. And so we have that influence. Then speaking again about this monastery off the southern coast of France called Léron, we also have a theory that St. Patrick spent time in that monastery learning the monastic practices before he then went off to Ireland, where we know he was a huge influence on Christian people in Ireland. And so we can see that through the efforts of certain individuals who actually brought the principles of Coptic monasticism to Europe, that then it flourished and it expanded through the Benedictine rule, through the efforts of St. Patrick, and then it was taught to other people interested in developing monastic settlements and communities in their local areas.
Oh, thank you. I want to make two remarks and question, actually. The first remark is about monks fleeing persecution in Egypt and the positive outcome that came out of that. We read in the book of Acts that in chapter 8, after the martyrdom of St. Stephen, that there was a huge persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And those who fled away from the persecution, went around the world of that time preaching the word of God. And then they talk, the book of Acts explain who went where and the fruits of their missions. So it happens often that evil forces good to flee, and but God in his divine providence converts that evil act into goodness for humanity. And yes, indeed, there were in Egypt, even in the Christian era, persecution that people who differed different from each other of pronunciation of creed and speaking truth to power resulted in certain persecution. The Arian heresy, many of the rulers became Arians and therefore persecuted the Orthodox, and so on. So my second remark is, following on this, we can see that in today's politics and dynamics of world global events, that Middle Eastern Christians are being persecuted. We see hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Christians fleeing persecution and church bombings in Iraq. We see the same from Coptic Christians in the last 2 years in particular, after the 25th of January revolution. it's estimated 100,000 already left Egypt to form a Coptic diaspora, like we see now in Australia and Americas and Europe and elsewhere. And of course, it's a sad event. It's against a dark point against humanity. But God in His divine providence converts evil into good. And we see here in Los Angeles area, for example, new families, maybe tens of families in each church every week coming from Egypt. Back to my second remark is that Coptic monks going to Europe have resulted in the establishment of educational systems based on Western monasticism, like, for example, the Benedictine order and its educational system, and the Franciscan orders. And this kind of framework that started in Egypt and migrated to Europe and flourished there and continued to our day, because if you remove from world history the Catholic educational system of the Benedictines and the Franciscans and the likes, there would be a big hole in education. There wouldn't be many universities as we know today, like University of Paris or even Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard. They wouldn't be the same universities as we know them today if it were not for Western monasticism. And you can trace it back to Egyptian deserts. So your research work is really of great importance and, of course, special interest to me as a Copt. Please, I know that you traveled to Ireland in particular at least maybe once or twice to collect evidence that helps you in your research and analysis of that point of influence of Coptic monasticism. Would you graciously speak to us more about what did you find in Ireland that helps your research?
Well, in the museums in Ireland, specifically the National Museum of Ireland and also the Chester Beatty Museum, the library there, they have Coptic manuscripts. So it gives a student in Coptic studies an opportunity to look at manuscripts and study them firsthand. So I went to Ireland for that reason, to look at manuscripts, to try to resolve for myself if there was a Coptic connection. And I have found many interesting things that allude to that fact. One of the most recent finds, actually, in a peat bog in Ireland in 2006 is very interesting to me, and I'm sure to your listening audience as well. And it happens that they found a manuscript from the 8th century buried in a peat bog in Ireland. Peat is a heat source in Ireland, and so it is farmed. And one day a farmer was plowing his field, and as he was scooping up this peat, he noticed something was hanging out of the machinery. He stopped the machinery, went out and took a look, and it was a manuscript. And so he called the conservators at the National Museum of Ireland, and they came rushing out because they do find things in the peat bog that they're able to restore, but not a book. And so this was an enormous find for the country, an enormous find for scholars as well, to have this manuscript, which turns out it was a psalter. It was a book of Psalms, but it was in very poor condition because the waters, the acids, the chemicals that are in the water of this peat bog typically will dissolve anything that's in there over time. So the fact that this manuscript somehow survived the elements that it was sitting in for several centuries is a miracle. And the fact that the farmer didn't mutilate the manuscript is also a miracle. And so they have been able, through very interesting technique, state-of-the-art equipment. They have been able to preserve this manuscript so that we can actually look at the pages today. And it is interesting because there are inferences to Coptic influence in this manuscript in two areas. One is the leather cover. Actually, it was found that it contained papyrus fibers inside the cover, and that alludes to a practice of using papyrus, something called cartonnage, which actually is waste, papyrus waste, scraps of papyrus glued together to create a hard cover for books. And so the fact that this was found in this particular manuscript is very interesting. Also, the illumination of the book, the drawings and pictures that were contained in this book speak to Coptic art principles, and so there's some inferences there as well to Coptic influence.
Fascinating, fascinating, the story of the rescue of
Yes.
an 8th century book in the 21st century Ireland during a farming process is fascinating, and the fact that it leads us to discovering one more evidence of Coptic Irish connections from such a remote time frame is fascinating. One point I would like to get your feedback on is when you finish your degree in Coptic studies as a Ph.D. and you continue your teaching career, you already taught medieval and ancient art history at California State University in Stanislaus, and so you will return to your teaching career and at a higher level, higher responsibility. But people always think, maybe not many universities will hire me because I have a degree and a focus in my PhD dissertation on Coptic studies. Do you have an advice or from your own personal experience what to expect after you receive your PhD?
Well, as a matter of fact, I was talking with a colleague from a university that I would very much like to work for at some point. And I was sharing with him that I am studying the history of Christianity as my PhD program. And he was listening to me, but he wasn't very interested in what I had to say until I mentioned that I am focused on Coptic studies. And then he was very interested in what I was studying. So that, I think that it's a selling point for me that I do have this experience, because there's many people who graduate with a degree in the history of Christianity, but not so many in Coptic studies. So it really defines my work and my skill set and makes me, I think, more employable. So I hope that's the case. We'll see. Yeah,
that's very encouraging. I'm delighted to hear this story. And but also beside that, when you have a foot in Western monasticism and another foot in Coptic monasticism, and actually you are studying the interface.
Yes.
Between and the mutual the influence in one direction in this case, but there is also influence. I mean, when Roman aristocrats came to Egypt, they also somewhat influenced Egyptian desert, whether to react to this influx of so many Europeans coming to become monks and nuns in Egyptian deserts in the 4th century. So, so this study of the interface makes the person expert in two areas.
Yes.
And that's another broad area that a graduate from such a PhD program can find employment in both fields. And that's there is a new trend now. They call it interdisciplinary. Is that something you can relate to before we conclude our segment today?
Well, that is the direction that American universities are taking in their programs. They're realizing that the hard line that used to exist between disciplines isn't practical anymore, that the history department needs art, that the religion department needs history. So somebody like myself who can teach in different areas and understand the broader picture is becoming a commodity that's of interest to universities today. So I'm very encouraged by that, because I myself find the conversation gets more interesting when you can pull in different disciplines and talk about the bigger picture. So I'm very happy with that new trend.
Indeed, and it also shows that the Coptic civilization and Coptic life, in terms of monastic life, spiritual life, liturgical life, social life, political life, they all connected. They are all connected, and they are also connected to world civilization and world history and world politics and world economy. And as we conclude this segment, I would like to thank you, Patricia, for graciously accepting my invitation to appear as a guest on our program today.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And we look forward to future reading of the products of your research, the results in some publications. And to our viewers, we thank you for watching us, and see you next week in a new segment of Logos TV program on Coptic civilization and Coptic life.